So the paper trail continues, and we're moving into the evaluation process. The student was referred to the student assistance team. They did not respond to Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions, and so a referral is made and the process continues. So a request for an initial evaluation to determine special education eligibility must be done and must be done in writing. Rule 340-1721, so from the Michigan rules, within 10 school days of receipt of a written request for an initial evaluation of a student suspected of having a disability, and before any formal evaluation designed to determine eligibility for special ed programs and services, the public agency or the school district shall provide the parent with written notice consistent with 300-503 and, when necessary, shall request written consent to evaluate. There will be places in the rules and regulations that refer to school or calendar days, and it's important to note when reading what is required. The definition can be found in the Federal Regulations 311. So a request for special education evaluation can be made by anybody, usually by a teacher or parent, but within 10 school days. So doesn't count Saturdays and Sundays when you're counting it, okay? So if they receive a written request tomorrow or like on a Monday, you have 10 school days in order to provide the parent with notice. So, and the written request can come from a parent, it can come from a teacher, it can come from anybody. A parent can request an evaluation before the student has even gone through the SAT process. Remember, we talked about that in the last PowerPoint. The school district must comply with the request, but they can make sure that the parent is aware of the school's SAT process and the response to intervention piece that goes with it. And that if a special evaluation is done before the SAT process, the team may not have enough data because they don't have information about how the student will respond to those interventions in classroom to find the student eligible for special ed, and they may find themselves back at the SAT process. Let's say that the student's gone through the SAT process. They had to go through, they did not respond to Tier 2, they had to do Tier 3, they did not respond to any Tier 3 interventions done, and they made no progress. So the teacher or the parent makes a request for an evaluation. If this is the first time that an evaluation is being requested, then it's called an initial evaluation. And you must have parent consent. It must be obtained to proceed. If you're going to do any evaluations, the parent has to give consent. And the parent must be provided notice. So the parent has to be provided notice that the school district suspects a disability. So remember when the SAT process was being done, the interventions were happening, they did that the evaluation of existing data, the read, and they determined that they probably need some more information. So once the student is done, when that Tier 3 happens and they're not making progress, the school district suspects a disability. They know they're going to ask for an evaluation to be done, at least of some kind. If they need information through that read, they're going to have to ask the parent for consent. But they have to notify the parent first. So the parent has to be notified that the school district suspects. If it wasn't the parent who asked for the evaluation. The parent says, yes, we suspect a disability. They have to give the parent all the information. They have to be informed when they're given the notice. Okay, what disability are we looking at? Why do we suspect it? And hopefully the parent was part of the SAT and is aware that the district suspects that the student may be eligible for special ed. Hopefully it's no surprise. However, there are occasions where the parent has not been brought into the process. It makes things smoother if there is communication with the parent throughout the entire process. Hopefully the general ed teacher has been communicating with the parent from the onset of any difficulty. In order to ensure that the parent has been made aware of the rules and regulations, they require the parent receive notice. The regulations provide mandates on what must be included to fit the requirements of a notice. Once the parent's provided with the notice, the district, if they need any additional assessments, remember they went through that READ process to determine, do we need more evaluations? If they need more evaluation, then they have to obtain consent from the parent to do the initial special education evaluation assessments. The special ed evaluation is different than any other assessments that are done or evaluations that may happen in the classroom, like tests and quizzes that are given to all the students, or the school or school district-wide assessments that are given to all students. You don't have to get parental permission to have those done. As this is a specific evaluation being given to an individual student, parents have to be notified, and for determination of eligibility, the parent must give consent. If the parent does not give consent, the IEP can be convened. It's recorded that the parent didn't provide consent, and so the district does not have enough information, as an evaluation could not be completed to determine that the student is eligible. So the student would be found ineligible at that point. Remember that there are two parts to the regulations. Part C, birth to 3, and there are some different timelines and terms. So the referral may come via phone call, a fax from a physician's office because the child's so young. There's a 45 calendar day timeline. And the letter is sent home with 2 forms. And that's from the referral to the IFSP process. Birth to 3, the screening is complete, the IFSP is developed, and most of the time the home visits are done and there's play groups. A plan is reviewed every 6 months and then annually, and it has to be in place no earlier than 9 months prior to the child's 3rd birthday. A transition plan has to be done on how we're going to transition from Part C to Part B. This is early on with special ed, so this is talking about the birth to 3 group, talking about their screening, the IFSP meeting, the calendar timeline, and if special education services are needed at the time of transition when the child's going to transition to 3 years old, then an IEP is developed. So when we're looking at pre-referral eligibility, Part B, that's 3 years to, in Michigan, 26. If you get a written request for evaluation, the parent has to be provided with notice that there's a suspected disability and a potential evaluation. If you haven't done a read, do one quickly at that time, and within the 10 school days of receiving the written request, you have to ask the parent for consent to do an evaluation. From consent to evaluation to the IEP being completed, you have 30 school days. So that's school days, not calendar days. From the time the written request for evaluation is received, when you get consent, you have 30 school days to complete. So from consent to evaluation to IEP, 30 school days. The MET team is determined by the disability that's being considered. So in the evaluation process, the evaluation is performed by a multidisciplinary evaluation team, or the MET team. And the MET team, the group that's doing that, is determined by the eligibility of the student. So how do you know who to include? You don't have to guess. The information is provided in the regulations and rules. So Federal Regulations 308 in federal regulations give broad information. The federal regulations leave it open to the states to make more specific rules to define eligibility categories. The Michigan rules, 340.1702 through 340.1717, provide specific guidance on the MET for each eligibility that the team that determines it. So there's a specific checklist for each eligibility. Remember, we have 13 eligibility categories. So for each one, there are specific criteria. So let's look at traumatic brain injury. That's a determination of disability shall be based upon a full and individual evaluation by a multidisciplinary evaluation team, which shall include an assessment from a family physician or any other approved physician. So there has to be an assessment from a physician, and then there can be other people involved in that can be chosen based on the student, but there has to be an assessment from a family physician. If we're looking at a multiple impairment, it says, a determination of impairment shall be based upon a full and individual evaluation by a multidisciplinary evaluation team, which shall include a psychologist, and depending upon the disability in the physical domain, the multidisciplinary evaluation team participants required, and then it lists 1707. It goes through some of those that may be required in that eligibility, depending on what specific piece you're looking at in the severe multiple impairment. But there has to be a school psychologist. And then depending on the biggest factor for that, that would determine the other members of the team. And it tells you which team members in those other rules. This is, if you can see it, this is a MET form, and I'm going to have some of these in the doc sharing or for you to see in the weekly lesson. How does the MET know what to look at to determine if a student is a student with a traumatic brain injury or a severe multiple impairment? The requirements are provided in the rules. So in 340-1702, it says these things will determine whether a student is a student with a traumatic brain injury. In Lenawee County, the Lenawee Intermediate School District has created forms with the information to determine eligibility for each category. So if you're looking at a student with a traumatic brain injury, the necessary MET team would get together and they would use this form, and then they have to look at each piece. And then I've also included the MET form when you're going to look at a student with a severe multiple impairment. So the evaluation requirements, because once you determine the MET team, if they have to do an evaluation, there are specific requirements they have to follow. It has to be in the student's language. There are a number of things that have to be done. And it talks about an initial evaluation. It talks about screening for instructional purposes that is not an evaluation. It talks about reevaluations and the specific procedures and any additional requirements that have to be done. So everything's covered, and those people on the MET team have specific procedures that they have to follow. So in determining eligibility, an evaluation is completed. Then an IEP is set up, and don't forget that there's a 30 school day timeline. So an IEP is set up to discuss the results of what the MET team has found and determine whether the child is a child with a disability and if they're eligible for services under the IDEA. There's a representative from the MET team that has to bring the information and discuss it with the IEP team, and they give a recommendation. The MET team does not say whether the child gets to have an IEP or not. The IEP team looks at all the information and determines whether they think the child is eligible. The MET only makes a recommendation to the IEP team. The determination of eligibility is a team decision. The IEP team, which has specific members that we're going to talk about as we move forward, looks at all the information presented. They look at any of the assessment data, they look at all the interventions done, they look at all those pieces, and then they determine if the child does or does not have a disability. So if the child is determined not to have a disability, they could return to general ed. The parent can request a 504, remember that one? Or the child could be determined to have a disability. So there's two things. Child is either determined not to have a disability, or they're determined to have a disability. If they're determined not to have a disability, the IEP is completed fairly quickly. And if they are determined to have a disability, then there's more information that has to be put into the IEP. It's a little longer process. If they're found to have a disability and the parent refuses the services, remember they cannot seek services under 504. And always remember through the process that if they're found eligible, then the IEP must be developed. And we should always be asking, is this the best we can do? The question is not, is it possible to educate all children well, but rather, do we want to educate them badly enough? And do you have any questions? And if you do, remember, post them in the virtual office or through the discussions so that we can have a discussion about them or answer the questions, or you can contact me individually through email.